Um, well, thank you for joining today's Perspective series. Today's event is going to be on youth employment. And so just before we begin, I just want to let you know that the event is being live streamed, so feel free to keep your camera on or off. It's totally up to you. Also, any attendees, feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. Feel free to do so, and we'll also be monitoring the chat, and also feel free to ask your questions there.
Perfect, thanks, Max. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and give thanks to the Indigenous land on which we're all occupying. I'm currently streaming from the region of Peel, which is part of the Treaty Lands and Territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. Many of our panelists and my co-host, Max, is streaming out of the city of Vancouver, which is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for these lands and continue to do so today. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on these lands, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. I want to acknowledge that this land acknowledgement is a small but important step towards reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples. I would also strongly like to encourage everyone to educate themselves on the history of the land they are occupying and actively get involved and immerse themselves with the TRC calls to action.
Thank you, Josh. So today's Perspective series is focusing on youth employment, and it's brought to you by Youth Leadership Initiative, or YLI. So our program is under the banner of the Disability Foundation, and YLI itself is a project that focuses on young people with disabilities and trying to address employment issues for young adults with disabilities in Canada. And so what we're trying to do is try to identify and address attitudinal barriers specifically with our research, and also we trying to create a toolkit for recent graduates and essentially try to aid them in overcoming and navigating these barriers.
Awesome. So my name is Josh, and my co-host joining me today is Max. We are both coordinators with the YLI Youth Leadership Initiative Project, and are proud to bring you this Perspective series discussion that's going to focus on youth with disabilities and experience with employment. Our panelists joining us today are Louise Gaudry, an SIL coordinator for the Richmond Centre for Disability, Shoko Carento, a case manager in the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and Megan Tabner, a dance teacher and disability rights activist working to complete their graduate degree. If you would all like to go around and say a little about yourselves, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Shoko. Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you so much for having me here. As the introduction included, I work for the CNIB, Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and I manage programs and operations there for BC Yukon. Just quickly about my disability. So I identify myself as a person with disability, specifically sight loss or legally blindness. I also identify myself as an immigrant woman of color. Employment is very important topic for me, and I'm very excited to be part of this panel. So thank you so much.
And my name is Louise Gaudry, and I'm at the Richmond Centre for Disability. And my program is SIL, which stands for Supports for Independent Living, which is actually the pre-employment and employment programs of the RCD. So these include resources for career development, which includes our job club and our most recent In Motion and Momentum, and also resources for community participation. And you can find information about all of that on our website, which I can give you more information about it at the end if you like.
Wonderful. And hi, everybody. My name is Megan Taverner. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns, so feel free to switch it up. I'm a disabled dancer, actor, choreographer, artist in general, and a current graduate student at Dalhousie University in Mi'kma'ki. So I'm kind of interested in disability justice issues, both in and outside of academia. And then I'm really focused right now on making the dance and theater industries more inclusive to people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. So for myself, I identify as disabled and chronically ill, as well as mentally ill / mad. So lots of intersecting identities there. And I am also queer and genderqueer. So lots of things going on. So I kind of have interests that intersect gender, sexuality, disability, and academia in general. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Great, thank you, everyone. At this point, we'll be moving on to the general questions period. And just for the sake of coherency, we're going to have Louise go first, Shoko, and Megan, if that's all right with everyone.
Okay.
Perfect. And Max, do you want to start us off with our first question?
Sure. So our first question is, when addressing issues related to the employment of young people with disabilities, what topic or possibly topics needs more focus, in your opinion?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. What I would like to see happen within the community, within working with employers, we've had over the many years, obviously there's been some progress in that we actually do have individuals with disabilities that are finding jobs. And I've been around long enough to be able to tell you that I'm really pleased to be able to see that, mainstream employers, not just organizations with disability that serve the disability community, are hiring. What we now need next is a little bit more flexibility, excuse me for waving my arms about, around, can we look at, is there some flexibility in the job descriptions so that there isn't needless barriers, like you must be able to type 30 words a minute. And perhaps there's a disability barrier there. And maybe 25 words will suffice. So that's where I'd like to see us go, and I still see there's room for it, is being able to look more freely at the descriptions themselves and see if there's some flexibility there.
Great. I totally agree. I think flexibility is very important. It's Shoko speaking. I also think the attitude of the employers absolutely needs to change towards hiring people with disabilities and youth in particular as well. Lots of youth are coming out of school wanting to get this first job. And if they don't get the chance, they won't be able to get the experience that they need in order to develop their career. Mm-hmm. So very important to change the attitudes of the employers as well. Another topic of focus I would mention here, which includes more internal focus as well, is the self-confidence. I know, speaking from my personal experience, self-confidence is something that I struggled with, especially when I was in my high school, university, post-secondary education. I did not embrace my disability, should I say. I faked it, quote unquote, tried to act like a fully sighted individual to fit in, quote unquote. And that was a very difficult life because I was not being true to who I am. So being self-confident about your own identity and just put it out there for everybody to see and to normalize disability, I think is very important piece as well. And last thing I'll mention is the job readiness skills. Another piece about internal focus and also the self-advocacy skills. So those are also, I think, important to combine together with the self-confidence to be able to be successful. So I can go into more details, but I know I have more questions to answer later. So yeah, that's my thought for the timing.
Wonderful. This is Megan speaking. I definitely agree with both of the topics that you have brought up. Where I was like leaning is yes into that self-confidence and thing, and transferable skills being a key
Yes.
aspect. I know for myself, like I was chronically ill first before I became disabled. And so navigating that transition, a lot of it was education for myself, but also seeing the lack of education around us. And I know for myself, I was disabled before I realized I was disabled. And so having that understanding, and also having a broad understanding of invisible disabilities and visible disabilities, can create such a different perspective on access and inclusion, especially in employment, is just understanding that people are already hiring disabled people, whether they realize it or not. And understanding that, and then also not having certain perceptions around like what disability is or how disability presents, I think is really key. And kind of that work ties in with advocacy and education work, is just reaching out to major employers and also smaller businesses and things where people might seem like, oh, we don't have the resources to hire disabled individuals, when in reality, they may have already done so and not realized it. And so just general education around this as well. So.
Thank you so much. I think those are all fantastic answers. In that same vein, what advice would you give to recent graduates or new graduates with disabilities who are just looking to enter the workforce?
If I may say, and this ties in perfectly with what the ladies have been saying, and I think actually that this is one of the advantage points that youth with disabilities have, in that every youth, whether you have a disability or not, is starting from that point of having a shorter resume than, say, someone who's been in the workforce for a bit. So this is where transferable skills, whether you get them, from your volunteer experience in the area that you're interested in, whether it's practicums that you did in your studies, all of that's going to be really important. So if you do happen to be someone who's coming from trying to do a job search and you haven't yet done some formal training, if you have not yet, then I would certainly suggest that that's a starting point for you. In my experience, having a program, whether it's a program such as an access program for those that have more of a learning challenge, or your college degree in another area, is especially important as a person living with a disability trying to get into the workforce. Thank you.
Yeah, such a great point, for sure. It's Shoko speaking. And maybe a couple other things I would add. First thing is maybe ties in with the self-confidence piece again, but it's okay to take up space in the society, in school, in world of work. I think sometimes there is this sense where it's like, oh, you should be grateful for what you get or what you have, and don't wish for something bigger, especially within the disability community. That's a personal feeling that I sometimes have. And I disagree with that. Sky's the limit. And it's okay to take up the space and voice your opinion and say what you need to say, which also leads to advocacy piece as well. And a few other things, more practical things I can think of in terms of tips for recent graduates with with disabilities, including vision loss, is really the volunteering, and volunteering experience is very important in terms of gaining experience. Yes, it's unpaid. Of course, we want to get paid for, but when you don't have experience and want to just get a sense for maybe an organization, a nonprofit organization that you wanted to work for, or gain some transferable skills and so forth, volunteering is very useful in that. And just to mention about my own experience, I have gotten 2 jobs through volunteering. I was a volunteer first, and then they basically noticed me and my work ethics, my abilities, my skill set and everything. And they, when I applied, I already had the advantage of that instead of trying to prove myself with a white cane in my hand. So I think that that's very important. And also, it is a job seekers market right now, as many of us have heard on the news and being talked about. So taking advantage of the job seekers market, employers are wanting to hire. So I really also wish that the employers do take advantage of the situation to tap into the disability community to hire more employees with disabilities. And last thing, or last couple of things, expanding your network, super important. I remember when I was in university, I was invited for different events. Sometimes I felt uncomfortable. So let's say I wouldn't be able to see the people at the event party, their faces. I don't know who I'm going to be talking to. I've never been there. How am I going to get there? There's a lot of concerns that popped in my head. But very important to make the effort to attend a lot of different events and opportunities and expand your network. You never know who you're going to meet, and that might lead to a job opportunity as well. And once you do get some kind of job, I always say this, negotiate. Negotiation is super important in any kind of career sort of situations. Even if you are, maybe you have had only one job or something very small experience-wise, and you don't think you have a leverage to negotiate, but it doesn't hurt really. Once you got the job offer or once you're already working, maybe there are opportunities to get a higher pay or climb up the ladder if that's what you're interested in. So always negotiate. That's another tip I wanted to mention.
Wonderful, thank you. It's Megan speaking again. I think a tip that I have as someone who, I'm only 24, so I would still consider myself a youth or a young person entering the workforce at this time, kind of in between school and employment, is kind of getting creative with what you can put on a resume or put on a CV. Most experiences that I've had have been around like managing my own care schedule and working through accessing home care supports or continuing care and various things. And so I see that as a complete transferable skill into a workforce in terms of like resiliency, but also getting creative with problem solving and schedule managing and various things. So there might be stuff from your own experience, either with your disability or chronic illness, or even caring for a loved one that you have in your extended family, where even though it's not necessarily a traditional job as we would see it, there are definitely skills that come out of those experiences that can be translated onto a resume or translated in an interview setting, where you can kind of expand on things that are kind of seem a bit out there when we're talking about employment, but the skills that you develop from those kind of things are really important to not sell yourself short and be able to say, I have these skills, I'm willing to work, I'm willing to do this, give me a chance. Like, it's really important to kind of have that self-confidence, even if you have to get creative along the way.
Thank you, everyone, for those answers. Tying into this, I know a lot of youth in particular have difficulty advocating for themselves in the workforce. How would you, and what advice or tips do you have for youth with disabilities entering the workforce for them to better advocate for themselves and actually take up that space?
Okay, and so are you asking the question related to disclosure at this point as well, or?
Yeah, so it would be disclosure, how to advocate for the time.
Yeah, and I think specifically with relation to the disclosure question, which I know is one of the ones on the list that you had, I would say that there isn't an absolute answer as to when one does so. Just to give you an example from my personal life, I am an individual living with cerebral palsy and I use a power wheelchair. when I applied for this position, you bet I put it on the cover letter, right? Because I know that the RCD values my life experience and understands that. On the other hand, when I've applied for other positions, I personally don't choose to disclose on my cover letter. I instead would very strategically wait until the individual phones me to offer me an interview. And at that point, I would say, because this would be before COVID, can I confirm that your office is wheelchair accessible? Yes, when I did that, sometimes I would hear them sucking back air, but they're not going to not offer me the interview. Because they've called me to do that. Similarly, I have experimented with not disclosing. I Googled the location, found that they were accessible. But when I went for this interview that I'm thinking of at the moment, they were visibly angry when I showed up. And so you do sometimes have to be prepared for that. Not everyone is as enlightened as we would like them to be. And so if you choose not to disclose, which is your right, you may face that. For me, it's difficult to show up and not have it be obvious, right? So it's a strategic. And of course, there are many companies that are they'll have sections on their website where they want you to identify as a visible minority because they have an active interest. And in those cases, absolutely. And then it's a personal comfort question as well.
Absolutely. Disclosure is such an interesting topic. Yeah, it's true. There's no right or wrong answers, but I definitely have developed my own strategies around it as well. Yeah, to answer the question in terms of the advocacy, self-advocacy, so I think the first thing first is self-awareness. And when I say this, sometimes people don't really understand, or maybe they just take the surface of it and say, okay, I know myself. No, we don't know ourselves sometimes because we find ourselves in a comfort zone, and we have a strategy in place. We have, we know what to do, and we're comfortable. So, rinse and repeat, right? When we put ourselves in a situation where you feel uncomfortable or very scared, maybe, that's when you really learn about who you are and what are the reactions you may, default reactions you may have in certain situations. Do you withdraw? Do you say nothing? You go silent? Or do you get angry and you just start screaming? What do you do? And I think that's the piece when I say self-awareness. And when it comes to employment, it's all about putting yourself in the situation that you haven't been before. Because when you develop your career, you're always challenging yourself and doing something you're not quite sure yet. It's almost like you're not fully standing on your own feet. You're kind of tiptoeing and trying to kind of reach a little bit, above. And then you start to learn, and then, almost like fake it till you make it kind of situation. So I think that's super important for the self-awareness piece, and being comfortable in the situations where you feel uncomfortable. It's very counterintuitive, I guess, but that's something I have learned in my sort of life in general. And lastly, the communication skills. When it comes to advocacy, you don't want to burn bridges because you never know who knows who. And nowadays, everybody is talking on social media, so you just need to be careful and being strategic about what you say, how you say, and you want to make, you don't want to burn those bridges. So yeah, that's it from my perspective.
Yeah, I think in terms of self-advocacy and kind of gaining that confidence to be able to kind of put yourself forward and take up space is, for me, was finding community. And that kind of ties in with self-awareness and all of that as well, because there's a lot of things that I didn't know that I could ask for or didn't know how to ask for. And so I found myself in a lot of scenarios where I had to leave a job or move on to something else because I just couldn't figure out how to work and how to make things work and how to occupy that space. And so for me, it was reaching out to people with the same conditions that I have, reaching out to other disability advocates and activists like within my local community, and reaching out to like elders in the community who have a lot of experiences as well, and just trying to connect with as many people as possible who have the mental capacity to kind of help and guide you through some of these issues. So I know for myself, in terms of disclosing, it was a lot of back and forth for me, trying to figure out, oh, do I disclose? Because to a certain extent, my illnesses are invisible, but then I also am a wheelchair user. And so in certain scenarios, it has different outcomes. And so to help myself navigate that, it was reaching out to other people and saying, okay, how have you navigated this similar work environment? And for me personally, working in the theater and dance communities, it was reaching out to like other wheelchair users who are actors and who are dancers and who are choreographers, and saying, okay, what's it like? What can I do? How do I navigate this? And then if you are brought up against someone who is very unkind and uneducated in terms of disability issues, then you kind of have someone to fall back to kind of help you either deal with that instance or to help you advocate for yourself. And a last point in terms of those things is usually there are community organizations. I know where I'm located in Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki, there's like Autism Nova Scotia, who does a lot of great work in connecting people to employment specific practices. And there's usually community organizations that work with you on what kind of level of disclosure you want to have, so they can get you a job opportunity, but then you don't have to disclose at any point whether you are disabled or not. But they can kind of help you get your foot in the door in that sense. So yeah, it's really that community aspect, I think, is the number one thing for navigating everything.
If I may just pick up on the comments that the ladies are making on advocacy and disclosure, because the two go together. One of the things I always say to people, and we've touched on that, is it's an addendum from gambling, but I think it's very relevant to people with disabilities. Know your limit, play within it. And so when you're advocating for yourself around what your needs are, for example, in the workforce, know what you're going to need. Like sometimes you may not get a chance to disclose that you have your disability needs until near the end of your interview, where they say, do you have any questions for us? Because they haven't actually said anything. And in my experience, know what your need is and know what your solution is. Because you don't know whether that employer may have had no exposure to disability. So the minute you say, oh, I have this accessibility need, if they don't feel they've got an answer, that's going to spook them a bit, potentially. So when you have the solution already for them, for example, for me, and there are more programs now because I'm using a program with Google that's quite good, but I use a well-known program called Dragon Naturally Speaking, or I have used it for typing purposes. And so it was a very easy tie-in if you can say, oh, for example, due to my being unable to type in a conventional manner, I use a program called Dragon Naturally Speaking, and I can connect you to programs that will provide some funding to acquire that. Right away, that alleviates the concern of the employer who may have questions in his mind, and it opens the door to being able to have more open conversations about what your needs are.
It's Shoko. I totally agree. And in terms of knowing yourself and your limits and how to overcome and educating the employers, people you work with, absolutely essential. I wouldn't say that's ideal, but that's a reality. People probably haven't encountered somebody with disability. In my case, it's vision loss. It's not very common. Although there's a lot of people with sight loss, different degrees of sight loss, but it's very invisible. So I think knowing and being able to educate, absolutely essential. But also, I really would like the employers to be more aware. That part has to also happen at the same time so that we're not carrying all the weight. It can get exhausting. I don't know if some of you feel the same, but it can get exhausting when I have to educate somebody from scratch over and over and over again. Some days I'm like, not gonna do it. I mean, if I can get away with them, I'm not gonna go there. So yeah, I don't know. I think it needs to be both.
I absolutely agree with that as well. I know for myself, like I have a laundry list of various conditions that affect various ways. Like I am on and off of tube feedings and ambulatory wheelchair user, some days power chair, other days my walker. And so when I'm in an employment situation, some people have no idea what to do with me because they're like, well, one day you can and one day you can't and this and that. And it's that education piece that is missing. And like why I do a lot of like disability advocacy work and activism is so that hopefully the next person that comes along who has a similar combination of medical conditions can have resources and have access and have things where they can go, okay, well, this is what we can do and this is what we can change. And so that other employers, as they go along, they're doing the work as well and they're educating themselves. And a lot of times it's really hard in any advocacy work. Like you can only say things over and over and over again so many times, but if certain people aren't willing to do the work and to learn, then we may not be able to bring those people along. But it's kind of, I know for myself, sometimes it's finding like websites or resources where there's like a list of organizations that are like disability friendly or have experience with like chronic conditions or even like mental illnesses and even little things that might not be related to your condition. You can kind of see those organizations that are like, okay, well, they've done a little bit of work on this certain thing. So maybe they might be more willing than someone else to kind of start that process and do that learning. But it's such a hard thing to go along to kind of advocate as you're trying to gain access to employment, but also you don't like, I know for myself, I don't want to be resilient all the time. I don't want to be advocating all the time. It's exhausting. It's a lot of additional work. So I know for myself, I'm pushing right now in community organizations to include an accessibility portion on their website to say, okay, we have wide door frames. We have like no stairs. If we have multiple levels as an elevator, we have accessible bathrooms and not just like wheelchair accessible, but fully accessible bathrooms and various things along the way, like low light nights, adaptive performances for arts community. So there's various things, but that kind of needs to be at the forefront. And for employment opportunities, I wish more employers had accessibility features so we don't have to do the work to go digging to be like, is this wheelchair accessible? There's nothing listed here. Okay, let's go to Google Maps and try to look. And that is so time consuming. So it's this balance of knowing yourself, but also knowing the like limits of certain organization or the limits of education where it is right now and kind of finding that balance, which is easier said than done, but we're getting there slowly.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your answers. I'll just repeat what I said in the beginning of the meeting for the Zoom meeting participants. If you got any questions to our panelists, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or raise your hand, or type your questions in the chat. It's up to you. And my question is kind of tying to Megan's latest comment, is actually about employers. So how do you think employers can improve in equitable employment practices?
Are you asking Megan, or are you coming to me?
I'm asking everyone still. So we'll
Okay.
start with you, Louise. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess it ties into, again, what we alluded to on at the beginning of the meeting, and I 100% agree with Megan. I would like to see, in my dream world, when I shut my eyes and dream, we have to do the same shift attitudinally in society as we did with, when women entered the workforce, or attitudes towards people of varying cultural backgrounds. It has to become that it's not an exception to the rule that a person with a disability is employed. It's the expected norm. And we're still at a place where we're making that transition. We're still at a place where, if employers are being inclusive, it's something that they're tooting their horn about, which they should, because we want to be inclusive. But I long for the day that it's just a given. There should be more an exception that you're not employed, because there's never going to be a world where it's the right match for everyone. But I don't believe we're yet at that point. And so I think changing your attitude toward the hiring of people with disabilities, so that you're coming at it from the perspective that of course they need to be employed versus being on assistance. And what can we do to, again, look at those job descriptions so that it isn't always, yes, we'll hire you as long as you can fit X. And if you can't fit X, sorry. So we're inclusive to a point, as long as with your accommodation, you can fit the box. I think that will make a much more inclusive world.
Thanks, Louise. Shoko, just before you start, Samantha has a hand up. Do you have a question?
Sorry, yeah, I just had a question that is kind of along the lines of what we're talking about around how, with this transition towards more accessibility and inclusivity, a lot of employers are starting to kind of put out these messages of trying to attract more diverse employees. However, I'm finding that sometimes it seems like maybe some of these blurbs or messages are kind of more marketing, and they seem maybe a little bit empty sometimes. So for me, in looking through job postings and trying to find, like a bunch of them now have these little sections at the bottom that are like, oh, we love diversity now. But it's like, how do you really gauge, like, beyond that, which companies are backing it up, or which employers are?
If I can kind of jump in here,
Sure.
I know that it takes a little bit of extra work to kind of go through like these organizations that are putting out like diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility and various things, because a lot of the time it is just marketing, and it is just for them to be able to tick a box and say, okay, we've done that, and then move on. And so it's really looking in like the actions of those organizations and looking, a lot of the time for me, it's like on their websites or their social media pages. Are they including image descriptions? Are they including alt text? Are they including transcriptions on their videos that they post, not just on their stories, but on their like main feed as well, and various things like that to look to see, okay, what are they doing? And also sometimes companies or organizations will have projects that they're working on or that they're funding to like for accessibility inclusion. Like I was recently part of a theater company that did a whole look at Nova Scotia in general, and went to disability activists in the community and brought us in and paid us to do the work, which is great as well, and to actually get information. So organizations who kind of do that work, and it's that saying of accessibility isn't the exception. If organizations aren't building accessibility into the foundation, then they're skipping parts and they're skipping steps and they're cutting corners. And so it's kind of reframing this as accessibility is the bare minimum. Like everybody should be able to kind of access something from the get-go, and then from there kind of build on things. And so it's kind of looking for those keywords of, okay, what are they doing? What actions are they physically taking to create inclusive environments? And also sometimes the web page design is something I look for too, to see, okay, is this very hard to look at? Is it easy to navigate? And so if they put effort into that too, sometimes that can be a signal, but a lot of the time it is trial and error, and it's going in and kind of putting yourself out there, and then 50-50 chance of this is going to be great or this is not going to work. And so it's hard, but it can be done.
Thank you.
Would you like to go first, Choco, or I'd like to add comment if I may?
Oh, please go ahead, and I'll add my comments and answer the
Okay.
questions after.
Yeah, and to me, this goes back very much, like I know exactly what you mean. The job posting that has at the bottom, we're an inclusive employer. So what you have to remember when you read that is that statement is covering all nature of disability. So then it comes back to what I was saying earlier about we're still very much at a place of, can you do the description as described with the accommodation that you're going to present to me that you need? So to use an example, if it was a warehouse job, for example, I'm not going to be the best match for that in my chair. So they're actually not really going to look at me in my chair unless it's an office job. But it may be the perfect match for someone with a mental health condition who's able to do that physical labor. So that's where knowing our limit and playing within it comes into play. Obviously, I'm not meaning that to insult your intelligence. I'm just trying to put that in the perspective from the employer, because ultimately for the employer, he's still wearing the hat of, I'm running a business and I'm going to have some flexibility, but that's still a little bit where he's coming from, right?
Absolutely, such a good point. And it's Shoko again. So yeah, my kind of comments around sort of finding out which employers are really actually accessible and diverse and equitable and so forth. Yeah, I had the exact same sort of concern as I was graduating from post-secondary, I remember. And that's when I was also still faking my disability. So it was a lot of, there's a lot of emotions going on at that time. There is a list of, Canada's 100 accessible and or diverse employers, I think, if I remember the name correctly. You can Google it and take a look. I think that some of the maybe companies, you use that as, again, the marketing scheme, but there's some kind of, there is some kind of resource there. You can take a look. Yeah, and also information interview. If you had, specific company, then maybe finding somebody who works for the company might be difficult. But if you just had a general industry that you're interested in kind of getting a job, then finding somebody through networking who works in that industry and which company, and just get a sort of insight into that company through the information interview, I think might be another possibility. And to Megan's point, I completely agree with the website piece. So from the perspective blindness, accessibility of the website is super important. Otherwise, we have no access to information. So just if they are actually taking it seriously and making it work to make their platforms accessible, that's definitely a good indication as well. But that's such a good question. And if nobody minds me just going ahead and answering the original question about the employers and what they can do.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So just to add something practical, I think establishing the accessibility policy with actual measurement within that company, I think would be something they can do to bring about significant change and a shift in their organizational culture and actually being accountable for it. So I live in British Columbia. I live in Vancouver. So we have passed, or BC has passed the Accessible British Columbia Act last year. And that includes having an accessibility, policy or strategy as an organization. That's part of it. It's still a framework act or legislation, so it's going to take years, judging from how the Ontario government did it. It's going to take years for the actual meat and potatoes will actually, be developed and implemented to make changes in our actual lives as people with disabilities. But it's a good start, combined with the accessibility accessible acts at the federal government level as well. I do see the policy level commitment, and now I would like to see that translated into the public and private sector and on the employers level as well. And I have to say just one last thing is in terms of job posting, whenever it says driver's license is required, that completely excludes all of us meaning the vision loss community.
Mhm.
We can't drive. So, I really would like to ask the employers when they have that job posting, job description, including driver's license required, is it really required? Is it the ability to get to point A to point B? Is it absolutely required to really be able to drive a car? So I think that's another part that really grinds my gears sometimes. Just being mindful and use imagination and being open to the abilities and what we can do instead of just denying it from the get-go.
I love that comment because I'm a non-driver due to my disability, and I sure understand that barrier too, as do many of my clients. Yeah, I agree.
We actually received another question anonymously in the chat, and this ties in perfectly with the research that the YLI team was doing when we were looking at burnout in relation to disability. So I'll read it for you now. Due to my disability, I require more hours to complete tasks than my colleagues without disabilities. Although I feel rewarded in my job, sometimes I feel like I'm running on a hamster wheel, trying to get as many things done as my colleagues and causing burnout. What advice would you give to someone who has a similar experience?
I understand that one because due to my own disability, I do work slower than some of my colleagues, and I'm very fortunate to work in a workplace where they're open and flexible about that. Sometimes it does mean I have to do a little bit extra when I'm working on a day that I'm working from home to catch up. But in my mind, I'm also one that needs to take a break a little more often. And so in my mind, that's how I balance it out. Well, I've taken a little bit more of a break, so maybe I need to do a little bit more sort of out of my standard times. If you're finding that you've got too much that you need to do, I mean, you can certainly talk to your manager and see, if there can be some flexibility, some job sharing, depending on what the barrier is that you're experiencing. And then it becomes also a question of what is the right balance for me? Is part-time a better balance for me than full-time? And it may be that full-time is not the right balance for you at this point in your life.
It's Shoko. Yeah. It's a very good question. And the burnout is real, especially in the nonprofit sector where I have always worked. That's my entire career. The burnout is already prevalent within the general public, that's, sighted people or the people who have no disabilities anyways in the nonprofit sector, and let alone us with disabilities working in it. It can be very challenging. I will go back to my first point about negotiation. Having a good relationship and communication with the supervisor or the manager, and being able to negotiate is very important, I think, in this case as well. And also prioritization, being able to prioritize what are I should combine, knowing exactly what your role is, what is the most important aspect of your role as what you're doing for your work. And what are some of the things that can be delegated? Let's say data entry. Some platforms are not accessible for some people with vision loss using speech software and so forth. Can the data entry be delegated to somebody else, for example, right? I mean, hopefully the platform is fully accessible, but sometimes it's not. So that's kind of a accommodation negotiation that can take place. Job sharing, like Louise was talking about, absolutely. I think that's another sort of piece to it that I was just talking about as well. And also having a good coworkers and support system. Oftentimes, if you're feeling burnout, most likely there's some other employees or coworkers who are feeling the same. So being strengthened in numbers, and being able to really take a step back and see, okay, is this work environment conducive to all of us, including us with disabilities or not? And what are some of the aspects that can be improved from more HR or people and culture perspective? So it could be that it's part of a bigger picture or a bigger problem as well.
And if I may, I'll just throw in there, we were talking earlier about working during COVID. It may be that if depending on your job, if you have the option to ask to work from home, you may find that saves some energy for you too. And then you can put that energy toward your work.
That's such a good point. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's interesting for me because I'm stuck in employment industries where burnout is the norm, or kind of seen as, it's like glorified or glamorized as like, if you're not burnt out, then you're not really working hard, or you don't really love what you do. And like, I have some pretty serious energy limiting chronic illnesses where I only get a few hours of the day where I can work manageably without having to take rest or naps or like breaks, brain breaks, various things. So it's funny because I'm in theater and dance industries as well as academia, which kind of thrive on this, like the show must go on, or if you're not publishing, you're perishing, and these really toxic work environments. But on the contrary, I've actually found that they've been the most flexible work environments, because a lot of the time you're doing things on your own timeline. Like there'll be certain deadlines, but if you have a proper communication with a supervisor in terms of academia, then if you work with the accommodations team at your university or college, find an accessibility support in the community, and then also have develop a relationship with, you only need one professor in the department that you're in to be able to support you to fight for you. So that's what I've found in the department that I'm in. I have 2 or 3 professors that are very supportive and are willing to take on some of the burden of advocacy for me, so I don't have to do that work all the time. And then finding a good accommodations officer at the university as well, and kind of in that team, we know I take about 4 times the amount of time as my peers do to be able to do something. But I'm still qualified as a full-time student, and I still get my full funding, because that's part of my accommodation, is to say I'm still doing the exact same amount of work. It just takes a lot longer for me to do. So when you add up the length of time versus like the shortness of the deadlines, the work gets done no matter how much time it actually takes. So we've been kind of able to play with the system in that sense, to say I might not be doing traditional full-time hours in an allotted week, but the extra energy that it takes for me to do something that is full-time from my perspective. So we're able to do that to make sure I can maintain funding at my school and be able to have work opportunities, because I know within university, unless you're a full-time student, you can't necessarily access the same like research assistantships or teaching assistantships or placements in the community. And so I'm able to work through that with them. And then on the flip side, with theater and dance community, it's been a lot of trial and error, and just talking with the people that I'm around, finding other disabled artists in the community and kind of forming community with them, and getting involved with projects that are centered on accessibility first, and like the mental well-being and physical well-being of the performers, and then kind of building from there. So it can be a bit tricky at first, but kind of finding those relationships and those communities can be very beneficial.
Great, thank you all so much. I know that it looks like we have about a minute left, and this was only supposed to be an hour, but I have one question for everyone that I just want to do, and then maybe we can try and get at least one individual question in, if that's okay with everyone time-wise. Okay, perfect. So the last question would be, what resources do you think every graduate with disabilities should know about?
In terms of resources, I would certainly suggest, obviously, that they should connect with organizations like RCD and the prospective agencies reflected here across the country. We can certainly assist you. Like I said, in my role is exactly that, to assist people with disabilities who are seeking employment. So definitely make use of the many agencies within the community, as I know Megan has also alluded to as well.
Yes, and I agree, Shoko. Yeah, I would mention my organization as well here. So again, CNIB, we offer a Come to Work program, which basically is employment support program for participants with disabilities, or sorry, vision loss specifically, and any level of vision loss. We don't check really if you're legally blind or you're just at the borderline or not. So very good resource for anybody who has vision loss and looking to enter into the world of work. We definitely have that. And another resource, just in the personal level, I would mention is what Megan was saying earlier, is really the community support. Being able to talk to somebody who has been there, done that, or just doing it together with you, and share the same lived experience. I think that's where a lot of strength comes from, for me anyways. So always good to share notes, and you're not alone. You're not on your own to have this challenge of getting a job or maintaining a job or switching your job. So yeah, that's another resource I would mention.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's Megan talking. A lot of times your provincial or territorial government will have a website, and usually through a bit of searching, a bit of scanning, following links, and kind of like the Wikipedia moment where you just keep clicking things. You can find certain organizations that do outreach. I know the Nova Scotia Health website has like a list of conditions, and then if you click in that, they have a list of various resources, so you can go through that way. Also reaching out to community organizations for specific condition that you may have. Usually there's a provincial or territorial organization that is catered to that. Even if you don't have that condition, but you think you could benefit from some of those resources, definitely reach out. I've had extremely good experience with that, saying, I don't have this condition, but I have a lot of similar symptoms to this. Is there anything that you could do to help me in that sense? And they can kind of connect you through employment resources too. And then the last thing I would say is utilize social media. Facebook support groups are a huge resource that I've found in the last few years that do a lot of advocacy work. Also hashtags on like Instagram and Twitter. They'll have like threads of different resources for different countries, different provinces, territories, like the whole thing. And so sometimes just following those hashtags, for example, on Instagram, if you follow a hashtag, it'll come up on your main feed as well. So I found a lot of really, really good resources just through that. So it's kind of, as Shoko said, like that networking aspect, but kind of taking it online and taking it to places where you can reach out to people who might be in different countries and they have different ways of viewing accessibility that could be really beneficial for yourself. So just kind of connecting to as many people and places as possible.
Mm-hmm. And if I may just add two things, I'm sure this is true for your other prospective agencies. I know with the RCD, even though I am involved with our employment programs, we do much more than that. We have information and referral. We have assistance to apply for provincial or federal disability pensions, if that's relevant. So the disability agencies can be a huge resource in a variety of ways. With that in mind, I would also, because I'm talking to you that are in the youth category, one of the more recent employment opportunity programs that we have here at the RCD is called the EEP program, the Employment, I'm missing the middle initial, but anyways, my colleague Vincent is administrating short-term work experience, paid work experience funding that they can offer to employers as you do that initial onboarding in a job, and it's hoped that it would become a long-term. So if you are 30 and 30 years old or younger, I believe it's 15 to 30, and you're job seeking, get in touch with us. If I could ask, and I'm one of you to type in the chat for me, I'll give you our web address. Our web address at the RCD is www.rcdrichmond.org. Thank you very much. Yeah, so anyways, thank you very much for that.
All right, and so just we'll try to move to individual questions. And a question to Shoko specifically. So Shoko, you in today's panel, you mentioned the importance of self-confidence for young people with disabilities entering workforce. I'm just wondering, are there other attitudinal barriers, and have you encountered with your clients, for example, have you encountered any other attitudinal barriers, and what kind of attitudinal barriers do you think come up in the job searching process?
Good question. Yeah, other than self-confidence, I think that there is sometimes an expectation of, I just, people will just do it for me. That's, I think, sometimes instilled from maybe overprotective parents, which I do have. So I can understand as well. So sometimes there is this, like the problem solving piece that needs to take place in terms of navigating a sort of a new world that you're not used to. And what are how are people are looking, like what are they seeing when you're doing when you are coming up the interview, or what are the expectations that they have when you are an employee, and just being able to take a step back and able to really objectively look at yourself. I think that's very important. And that changes the work ethics sometimes. I have seen in the younger participants that we have, some of them just have never been able to do things on their own because their parents were just always with them and guiding them and taking them to places and doing some of the homework for them. And I think sometimes that, can be the norm for younger people, and then coming out of it. And even school, I think education system can be, cuddly sometimes. And once they're out of the education system, there's a lot of resources that are no longer available to you. And you have to find your own way. You have to find your own resources and stand on your own feet. So that's one in terms of attitude of the participants, young participants that we see. I have heard. And then the last one I will mention is I think there is a misconception sometimes about blindness. If you're blind, you're not able to, you're not able to do anything. You're dependent. You're very unfriendly, or you have no friends, and you can't. You're just completely like powerless. So I think that's another sort of attitude that I have seen and I have heard from young adults and youth that we have worked with, that they just, sometimes there's just no sort of expectations of them to do anything. So and yeah, I think that sometimes mistakes happen. All of us make mistakes, and employers are like, oh, okay, well, she's blind or he's blind or they're blind, so that's why. In fact, maybe it's not. It's just a personal thing that they made a mistake and they have to own up to it and they have to fix it and learn from it. But there's this weird uncomfortableness to point out something when an employee with disability does something that's not really right. And then they don't say anything, and it grows and grows because there's no constructive feedback. So they continue to do, whatever. And then one day they're like, oh, okay, this isn't working out, so goodbye. And which is not fair. So I think, that those are some of the attitudes that I have heard. I'm sure there are other ones that those are that come to my mind right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rocco. And question to Louise.
Yes.
So in your practice, do you think there is a general strategy like that you can present to youth with disabilities that like conduct a job search? So, or do individual circumstances matter?
Well, certainly every individual circumstances obviously do, right? And that's where the knowing of yourself is that starting point. So if you don't know, like for example, you just know you want a job, but you don't really know what you want to do. You may want to do something, a course, which coincidentally are in motion and momentum, is exactly that type of a self-discovery course. What are my strengths? What are my abilities? Then I'm looking at, do I have the necessary education that I'll need, whether that is a post-secondary, some type of post-secondary education relevant to our particular challenges and abilities. And then as we've already talked about, doing that volunteering, because as Shiroko was saying, very often especially nowadays, you'll get that job because you volunteered first. An employer will much prefer if they've seen you on the job, doing the job. So those types of strategies, and of course, tying in with an organization that can support you in that, because they may have other connections. For example, many of you may be familiar with the organization WIN, which is acting as a headhunting company. Partners for Workplace Inclusion is their formal name. And they, innovation, not inclusion, innovation. And they actively act as a headhunting company and then reach out to individual employment agencies helping people with disabilities. So, there's connections there that can be made in that way. So those are the strategies I would suggest.
Thank you. And finally, Megan, I know that you're an avid dancer, you're a dance teacher, an actor, you're enrolled in academia currently, and you're also an advocacy worker. How do you navigate kind of balancing your academic and professional life with your personal needs and self-care?
Yeah, it's a continual exploration, I will say. First comes first is knowing and reminding myself that I deserve to be in the space that I'm in. A lot of the times, especially in academia or in acting or dance, there's not enough representation of disability in those fields. And so we get like, oh, I'm not good enough to be here, or I can't do the same things that my non-disabled peers can do. So that means I don't deserve to be here, when in reality, it's the opposite. We need more disability representation in academia, in the arts, performance spaces like that. So first comes first is just reminding myself, like, I deserve to be in this space. I'm allowed to take up space. I'm allowed to ask for accommodations. I'm allowed to have accessibility needs. And that's point blank, period. Like, there's nothing that anybody can say or do that will negate that factor. And so once I'm comfortable in that space, then it's allowing myself kind of flexibility and the word's not acceptance, but like compassion for myself to say, okay, this is a really bad health day, or this is a really bad week, and allowing myself the time and the space to say, okay, I need to regroup, I need to do this, and then I can come back and after I've regrouped, then do the work that I need to do. And so, but a lot of that just comes from that self-confidence and comes from that ability to say, like, I'm allowed to be disabled in this space, and I'm allowed to have ups and downs as I go along, because like my non-disabled peers are doing the exact same stuff. They're like failing, they're trying stuff, not doing well, various things, where I feel like I try to hold myself to a different standard, because it's that like need to push yourself to be able to do things that you think you can't do. And so it's this really convoluted kind of headspace you get into, but it's just like reminding yourself over and over, like, I'm allowed to fail, my peers fail too, that's okay, we can work with this. And then just taking things one step at a time. And if I face a issue or a challenge within the institution of academia, or within the institution of like theater and performance spaces, then I deal with that as they come. But to try not to allow myself to get into like a defeatist scenario where it's like, oh, I'm not going to bother trying that, or I'm not going to bother doing this because there's no way it's going to work out, when usually that's me just, it's like fulfilling a false prophecy. Like, that's not necessarily the case, and kind of trusting yourself to give something a shot. I know auditions for myself, I am at the point now where I'm good to audition for roles that are seen as like healthy or fitness people, because like I'm still fit, I'm a dancer, like I move my body, but it's in a different way to other people. And so now I'm willing to put myself in those spaces where I'm probably going to be the only wheelchair user in the room, but that's okay. Like it can challenge assumptions that we have for roles, and that's how we get representation in media and in academia and various things, like we just need to have that confidence to like put yourself. It may work out, it might not, but kind of deal with that as it comes, but just kind of putting yourself in the room and getting into the space and occupying space is really important.
All right, thank you so much for your answers. To be honest, it was an outstanding panel. It was great. Thank you to our panelists and for very insightful answers. And actually, thank you to our participants as well for your great questions. That was amazing. And honestly, I would be glad to have a part 2 of this talk. To be perfectly honest with you, and if you panelists agree, of course. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, just ending everything, I want to thank everyone, thank the audience for their questions as well. And I would just, before we go, want to ask if any of the panelists have any sort of social media, blogs, resources that they would like to advertise before we close off. So this is going up on YouTube, so people can continue to find you and follow everyone's story.
Yeah, I guess I'll plug my social media. So I can be found, I'll put it in the chat as well, but at May Taverner, so the first 3 letters of my first name and my full last name, on virtually all social media platforms. And then I also have a blog called the Chronically Ill Chronicles.ca, where you can keep up to date with my trials of entering the world as a chronically ill person. So thanks.
It's Shoko. I'm going to just mention my work website. So it's cnib.ca. If you want to volunteer, we have very inclusive volunteer opportunities for all abilities. And we also, of course, have different programs for anybody with vision loss and multiple disabilities, with a combination with vision loss as well. So, yeah, there's a lot of social media sort of associated to cnib.ca as well. So please do check it out. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Yeah, I got ahead of everybody and already we put up the website for the RCD, and I can tell you that the social media side of things is not my strength, but we've got a lot of people here that do. And if you go to our website, there are YouTube education pieces, and there is, of course, information on the programs that I offer, as well as our others. So you will find lots of information on our website. Should find interesting.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, and hope to connect with all of you in the future.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, bye guys.